Welcome to my review of Dune 2021. I haven't read any of the books, nor do I have to for this, to be clear. The film has to be able to support itself. Simple as that. I'm not reviewing the book. In we go. Just by nature of being the very first thing in the story and being its own cordoned off section unto itself, this is clearly meant to be in the back of your mind for the entire story. Any and every little thing going forward that could be informed by this sentiment is meant to be. Functionally, this works the exact same as an opening crawl, omnisciently giving us information about the story's alternate world. But peering ahead with full information, the presentation here is virtually the exact same as this film's subtitles for characters speaking in foreign languages. Bottom justified in the same font, size, and color, even with that same uncommonly long delay after the speaking begins. So yeah, those are subtitles of what's being said by the throat singing. And there is a lot more to say about that. But that's all I'm going to go into right now until it makes itself relevant again way down the line.
My planet Arrakis is so beautiful when the sun is low.
The use of narration to facilitate exposition is typically frowned upon as a storytelling device. As it should be. It is bad, because it's essentially antithetical to the fundamental nature of storytelling. A story is an account, not a statement. A statement exists to tell its substance. A story exists to show it. Narration is bad in the same way and for the same reason it's bad when characters say and do things in unnatural ways, just for the purpose of informing the watcher. Bad in the same way because it's unnatural. Bad for the same reason, being out of a goal of expositing information. Exposition is well crafted when the scene commences in a natural, believable fashion with the information that would emerge emerging, and poorly crafted when it's the opposite, when it's forced or sterile and conveys the unnatural sense that the scene is artificially orchestrated for us, the audience's benefit. Because of course all scenes are. It's the well-written ones that have orchestrated a plausible natural proceeding in such a way that the naturally emerging information is the information we need to know. And the poor ones that slide further down the scale towards turning and speaking that information through the fourth wall at the viewer. And the very end of that scale is essentially what narration is. And the same goes for opening text as well. Turning and speaking through the fourth wall. And while you can do nothing to remove the artificiality of the explicit information in a narration, it can be a foundation to house a bunch of natural and subtextual exposition within it. That one first line, "My planet Arrakis is so beautiful when the sun is low," already on its own has likely dozens of individual pieces of natural subtextual exposition in it. So to name some, this narrator speaks the English language. The English language exists in this world. The existence of the English language in this world implies the existence of Earth and much of our same Earth history. There is a planet called Arrakis. This narrator lives on Arrakis. This narrator's young by her voice. This narrator's female by her voice. She feels attachment to Arrakis by her tone. She's likely native to Arrakis by the fact she said, "my planet." This world, more likely than not, has interstellar travel and multiple inhabited planets by the fact she would even refer to it that way. She's likely a human by her voice. The fact that she's likely human and is likely native to Arrakis indicates that this likely Earth-based, likely interstellar humanity has been interstellar capable and colonizing since before this girl was born. It's possible for humans to inhabit Arrakis, which carries its own astronomical, geological, geographical, and meteorological implications. Arrakis has one sun. Arrakis has meteorological conditions which allow you to see the sun from the surface at some times. Arrakis is not tidally locked to its one sun by the mention of it being low, indicating its motion across the sky, which carries its own astronomical, geological, geographical, and meteorological implications. The acknowledgement of the existence of a sun and planet, let alone her existence as an organism that can speak, indicate the presence of various universal physical circumstances and elementary laws and particles and forces and such. That's all in that one line of dialogue on a black screen. And from the rest of her line...
Rolling over the sands, you can see spice in the air.
Arrakis, more likely than not, is predominantly characterized by sandy geography. The surface of Arrakis contains a material called spice. By her tone, the girl expresses wonderment at even the thought of this spice, which itself carries additional implications. This spice substance is indicated to be naturally occurring, and evidently is light and granular enough in its natural form to be carried into the air by wind. Arrakis has winds. It may be inferable by the use of the word air that Arrakis' atmosphere is similar in content to Earth's atmosphere, which carries implications for human habitability, and so on. You get the gist. Then there's the whole other side of it, from the visuals and sound. For one example, this cut from Arrakis' serene beauty to the Harvester. Very deliberately, abruptly cutting, breaking the calm wisp of sand and the tinkle and twinkle of spice with its industrial groan and clang. It's so great how it conveys the discomfort and interruption, and even more so with the score by interrupting that constant pulse right before the next beat was supposed to hit, and just as that pulse was starting to accelerate too. It atmospherically asserts how much of a gross interruption the harvesting is to this natural beauty of Arrakis. And this impression coming from the girl's perspective, being presented alongside her narration about its beauty. That's characterization for the girl from how it's cut. Now, of course, narration is bad. Less of the bad is less bad. So we want as little of it as possible, but what we always want to consider is whether the benefit of what you can get outweighs the cost of the narration's artificiality. And so to that point, a positive case would be the next line.
At nightfall, the spice harvesters land.
The sheer expedience with which that narration can deliver the explicit information it does, as well as the truckload of subtextual information attached to it, as unambiguously as it does, simply couldn't be matched by natural display. Same for this line.
The outsiders race against time to avoid the heat of the day.
These lines' absence would mean a scale-tippingly appreciable loss of exposition, so in their case, it's worth taking the hit of keeping them. Where it's not worth taking the hit is on this narration line.
They ravage our lands in front of our eyes.
Where everything it communicates, explicitly and subtextually, is all communicated redundantly and superiorly by other narration lines, including but not limited to...
Their cruelty to my people is all I've known.
And by the events on display during the narration, and or the sound and cinematography of them.
These outsiders, the Harkonnens, came long before I was born. By controlling spice production, they became obscenely rich. Richer than the Emperor himself.
Narration in an alternate world story tends to predominantly concern itself with world building like this history. And for the same reason, alternate world stories are where opening narration most often crops up, because world building is the hardest thing to naturally show in a timely fashion. And unlike in a real-world set story, an alternate world setting doesn't have the vast real-world domain of information to draw upon. An alternate world story's setting is built ground up, virtually from scratch, and the setting is the most urgently required pillar of the narrative. The plot can't be comprehended without a setting foothold. The coherence of the story depends most innately and immediately on world building, the state of things, history, locations, people, rules, where, what, and how everything that is. The difficulty being that these immediately relevant foundations can often be rooted from disparate, obscure facets of the world which couldn't all be simultaneously present in a concise, natural sequence. So the compulsion to fudge it in the form of opening narration or opening text most often arises at the desire to deliver an initial bundle of world building so you can establish a foundation for the plot to commence within. So to avoid falling into implementing opening narration or text in your alternate world story, overall, of course, you gotta work hard in the writing, but either one, work and rework and redraft and retool as much and as long as it takes to orchestrate a sequence that naturally contains a gigantic cluster of world building information, and in such a way that such a density of information doesn't unnaturally insist upon itself. Or two, somewhat less insurmountably, work hard to structure the story to make understanding the beginning not have to depend on a dense, explicit, verbal world-building cluster, and instead only demand a consistent tap like everything else. Or three, work hard to structure the story to both not pack in a dense world-building foundation and let an alternate world natural sequence run while knowingly permitting portions of it to effectively be classed as mysteries within an inciting incident to retroactively be explained and understood thanks to a consistent flow of development instead of one extremely difficult to craft cluster. And speaking of inciting incident,
Our warriors couldn't free Arrakis from the Harkonnens. But one day, by Imperial decree, they were gone.
the film employs that third alternative to opening narration, in addition to narration. Plenty of details and intricacies of what we're seeing are left as mysteries, to be retroactively explained later on. What's so special about the spice that makes it valuable and in demand enough to make the Harkonnens presumably the richest group in all of this civilization? Is Arrakis unique in possessing it? If so, what is it about Arrakis that makes it uniquely possess spice? Just how hot is Arrakis? Why do these guys have those blue eyes? Why do they have those breathing tubes? How and when and why did they first inhabit Arrakis? How do these warriors get beneath the sand undetected, know just the right spot, and then know just when to attack? Why are the Harkonnens so pale and hairless? Just how long before this girl was born did the Harkonnens come to Arrakis? And what led to it? Do they have to avoid the heat of the day because of their paleness, or independent of it? What is this weaponry? What about this weaponry? How does it work? How do these ships fly? What other technology do they have, and how advanced? How large is this empire's domain? What's the nature of its governance? And of course,
Why did the Emperor choose this path?
posing this question unanswered here at the start enriches the narrative going forward, since now every new development is constantly threading back to this question. From this prologue alone, the dominant presumption would be that it was to simply limit the growing wealth of his obscenely rich vassal. As the girl says,
By controlling spice production, they became obscenely rich. Richer than the Emperor himself.
but that'll merit re-examination with each new piece of world-building and characterization. And that's exactly the kind of natural narrative density you need when you're marred by the artificiality of narration. You gotta use it to pack in as much natural story development as you can to make that quality hit be as worth it as possible. And it does. We've got plenty of natural and/or subtextual story development from this prologue. We have characterization for the girl. The fact that she's only accompanying this raiding party, observing, not playing an active role, tells us this is likely her first raid. The score also conveys how green she is. There's that aforementioned pulse, which is suggestive of a heartbeat. Its tempo increases throughout the sequence, reaching a fever pitch nearing the moment of the ambush. This can of course be representative of her heartbeat, being extremely tense, further informing her as a first-timer. She loves her planet and hates the Harkonnens. The fact that she's here on this raid at all, being so young and a girl, tells us she believes heavily in their cause of resisting the Harkonnens. And that makes total sense, as she says,
Their cruelty to my people is all I've known.
so she'd already be poised for this by her experiences and her society's inevitable reinforcement of disdain for the Harkonnens. And with commitment of this kind and caliber can easily come obsession with a cause.
And who will our next oppressors be?
She fully assumes that any new owner of Arrakis will be oppressive to her people, An attitude that would obviously have been instilled in her and her people by the fact that it's all they've ever experienced from an owner of Arrakis. So very good characterization tied to the world building, the fact that much more likely than not she would think this way when her society is essentially an echo chamber of the view of hating the Harkonnens, the outsider owners of Arrakis. Much the same characterization applies generally to the rest of these warriors too. And on the topic of these natives, of the ones we see, they're all brown-skinned. This is the kind of sensical, implicit history world building that makes a world feel realistic. It makes total sense evolutionarily on a planet where you have to hide from the daytime itself because of how bright and hot it is, and wouldn't make sense otherwise, blue eyes notwithstanding. And that, of course, itself implies world building of how long humans have inhabited Arrakis for appreciable speciation to take place. And the wide variation of their skin tone makes even more detailed sense, since this isn't pre-civilization evolution, no. In a technologically advanced society over hundreds of generations, it just would be the case that some people would tend to be out in the sun a lot more, and some would be predominantly indoors, with the obvious effect that behavior has on mating. Now, with all the talk of the oppression and cruelty by the Harkonnens, we don't actually get to see any of it in this prologue. But at the very least, we do see this whip on the leader's waist. That, of course, implies cruel slave owning, and its on-call position at his waist implies prevalent presence of and regular cruel interaction with slaves. As for the logistics of this attack, we have the guards around the Harvester armed with rifles. We don't learn about the shields in the desert until later, so at this time, we're to naturally presume that ranged weapons are the status quo. These guards' presence stationed around the Harvester supports the world building of these attacks being prevalent, at least prevalent in these regions and conditions. It makes total sense that these buried warriors attack the riflemen on the ground before the Harvester is attacked, deal with the riflemen first so the gunners on the ridge have more time to egress before retaliation. We have just the one being showcased to us, but there's more of the same in the background. Considering the circumstantial surroundings of the situation, we see that the gunners know their targets well. They're not shooting haphazardly. Their 2 shots target the Harvester and as of yet unnamed Carryall separately, with 1 shot each. And they know their enemy well, they know the terrain and use guerrilla warfare to compensate their inferior numbers, ambushing instead of open combat, obscuring themselves using the weather, and disappearing into rock formations. And seemingly they know their terrain and enemy so well to be able to anticipate that the spice bed is rich enough that the Harkonnens would send a second Harvester, as evidenced by the fact that they would have already attacked the first Harvester otherwise. That is, unless they didn't expect it and were simply waiting for a Carryall to pick up the first Harvester to destroy both, as they end up doing with the second Harvester. The fact that these raiders target the Harvester that's landing with the Carryall rather than the one that's already here serves to indicate that the motivation here is to eliminate a Carryall even more so than a Harvester, since without a Carryall, the Harvester is more likely to be lost to a worm. That'd be development attributed to later in the film, though, threading back to this once we learn about Carryalls and worms and their attacks on Harvesters. The second Harvester landing gives us a reasonable explanation of how the raiders organized this attack, being that the Harvester was already here for a while, and it lets us be shown a Harvester landing while also showing us one harvesting, and shows us the immense harvesting resources the Harkonnens have to be able to allocate a whole second Harvester to one spice bed. We can see these weapons have little dials on them, probably power and focus of the beam or magnification and focusing of the scope. Oh yeah, there's a scope, by the way, and there may also be more dials on the other side. So credit, as always, where it's due. On the harvesting side of things, we see the Harkonnen spice harvesters are flown into place by a separate detachable vehicle. And when attacked, the harvesters themselves have countermeasures. The missiles from the intact harvester each splitting into 3 to maximize damage area rather than concentration implies that they're specifically anti-personnel or have an anti-personnel setting.
Our warriors couldn't free Arrakis from the Harkonnens.
This makes it blatantly clear that the Harkonnens leaving was not because of their resistance, and confirms the futility of this costly attack. which is now obvious is one of many futile attacks. And that's more development for these warriors' characters, of their level of commitment to the cause. There's a banner at every formation of troops. That banner for the Harkonnens resembles a sickle that could represent the reaping of spice, and the diamond that's surrounding it could stand for a crystal, as in crystals of spice, since at least in the raw form we've seen it thus far, it seems to make a tinkly noise and twinkles in the light. So, a banner representing the reaping of spice. That adds up. If they really have been here for that long, like the girl says, it makes sense to incorporate that fiefdom into their identity. The Harkonnens' magnitude and source of wealth parallels the real-world dynamic of trillionaire oil barons in Saudi Arabia, endlessly mining an essential resource in a desert and getting richer than countries off it.
Richer than the Emperor himself.
And with the oil parallel occupying lands of the natives for its natural resource, there's the clear parallel of these natives to American Indians. And now, these ships, the size of them, roughly, very roughly, they're about 4,700 feet across and 1,600 feet tall. And, via the use of a counting technique I call multiplication, I've ascertained that the number of Harkonnen troops on Arrakis comes to, at the very least, about 1.5 million. That enormous number of infantrymen displays the Harkonnens' enormous means, which makes sense as a result of their enormous wealth. That amount of men also suggests that the Harkonnens, and likely the militaries in this world at large, are heavily focused on infantry power for some reason, as opposed to the natural trend observed here in the real world, of advancement in military technologies causing a fundamental change in the model of warfare, spearheaded by the technologies employed rather than infantrymen, and so vastly decreasing the number of troops required and consequently existing. And that is very much not what we see here. Curious. All of that is naturally communicated by the events playing out and in the subtext of the overt narration. But being perfectly naturally exposited doesn't necessarily mean by any stretch that what was exposited is perfectly sensical without flaw. Plenty of what's here is superbly executed, most of it even, but here's what's not. Back on the logistics of the attack, if indeed it was unexpected that a carryall would drop a second harvester, there's marks against it for the unluckiness of 2 harvesters being present, given their built-in countermeasures. And we do have the question of why didn't they attack both harvesters once they knew there were 2? If you, for whatever reason, only have 2 laser guns to shoot with, by the way they're called laser guns, better to disable both harvesters, because it's the undamaged harvester and not the damaged one that fires missiles that kill a bunch of them. You could conceive of a reason for it. You could say, given that a carryall is a higher value target than a harvester, say they only had 2 shots for some reason, then say it was unexpected that a second harvester would be airdropped, then say the choice was made on the fly to attack the landing harvester and carryall out of a consensus of a self-sacrificial attitude of acknowledging the danger of leaving the other harvester intact to deploy its countermeasures. But that reasoning would be held up by total conjecture, as in it's not deducible from what's actually in the film, so it's not the film. And that's not even mentioning that we see that they definitely had more than 2 of those laser guns there on the ridge, which really destroys any of the potential of that reasoning. And speaking of issues with the laser guns, the propagation of their beams are visible over several frames. This being what comes first as establishment of mechanisms, it indicates that the weapons are not literally lasers, but are instead some other kind of thermal projection that doesn't propagate at the speed of light, a particle beam or plasma beam. But the problem then becomes, that I know that's not what the film intends to be saying. These are meant to be lasers, beams of photons. They're called laser guns. And every depiction of them after this one in the film depicts them correctly as lasers. No visible slow propagations that seriously muck up the world-building mechanics. Just instant full beam contact because it's the speed of light. It doesn't matter if it's a slow-mo shot because it's the speed of light. And on it being a light beam, the visible and very deliberate and showcased recoil from the gun is iffy, since it could also indicate that it's not a literal laser, or could still make sense as being a laser. The explanation being that the weapon emits seriously that much electromagnetic mass energy when fired. That is the quote-unquote mass that photons are by mass equivalence of energy equals mc² business. Photons are massless particles. They are energy of electromagnetic propagation. But energy and mass are the same thing in different forms, so photons do have momentum. That's why solar sails actually work in outer space. But just a super tiny amount that a laser pointer feels absolutely negligible force in your hand. But their emission does impart a third law equal and opposite force. The point being that if a laser gun emitted an insane amount of high-energy photons, then there could be an appreciable recoil. And if the case, that actually would bolster the world-building sensicality of how the beam actually does damage. The explanation being that it so rapidly imparts such an enormous thermal energy onto its target, enough to cause rapid enough vaporization and sublimation of the material to blow itself apart by its own expansive pressure. It's almost instantly hot, suddenly rapidly expands, that's an explosion. And this film's availability of that explanation is better than can be said for a lot of other science fiction literature. So yeah, thanks to that recoil, the most sensical version of what's here is actually outstandingly great on the science of the world building for the weapon's effectiveness. Or would be, if the beams had been shown to be light speed. And I don't know what happened when the rest of the film has them not only correctly, but in other ways too, superbly depicted as literal lasers. Although also, if damage is dealt by that mechanism of superheating, then you should see for at least a split second a very bright glow from the point of contact, since the destruction would rely on imparting an enormous temperature, and thermal emission is a fourth power relationship with temperature. Sort of like this. That would be your best case scenario of mechanics world building for the story. As is, the door is sorta cracked open for still that to be the case, albeit flawedly thanks to the slow beams here. And that's it for the laser guns. And the video. Thus concludes Review of Dune Part 1. Part 1 of a lot. Thank you so much for watching. Like and comment if you liked it, and subscribe if you want to see Part 2.